mind-bending physics. You sent us this research paper, and it dives into this concept of holographic time crystals.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild idea, huh? And it sounds like, something right out of science fiction.
It really does.
This paper, Holographic Time Crystals versus Penrose, brings together a lot of different areas of physics, actually. You've got general relativity, quantum field theory, even some condensed matter physics sprinkled in there. And to try to connect all these seemingly separate ideas, they use this theoretical framework called the ADS-CFT correspondence.
Okay, so before we get too far into the weeds here, can we maybe take a step back? I mean, I get that this paper is trying to figure out if these time crystals could actually exist. But before we even go there, what exactly is a time crystal? I mean, when I hear that, I think of some kind of glowing crystal that lets you travel through time. Probably not that, though, right?
Not quite. A time crystal is a little, well, it's a little more subtle than that. So imagine you've got a system, like a bunch of atoms, and they're in their lowest possible energy state.
Okay.
Normally, you'd expect them to, just settle down and be completely still. But a time crystal doesn't do that. It keeps changing, exhibiting these repeating patterns, even in its lowest energy state, like a perpetual motion machine, almost.
So it's like the system is constantly in motion, even when it should be perfectly still.
Yeah, exactly.
That seems to kind of go against everything we know about, how systems behave over time, right? I mean, things tend to settle down, not keep moving forever.
Yeah, and that's why there was so much skepticism around the idea of time crystals when they were first proposed. Early on, there were even these things called no-go theorems that seemed to rule them out entirely. But then the focus shifted to these Floquet time crystals. These are systems that show this repeating behavior, but only when you give them like a little push every now and then, a periodic nudge.
Oh, so it's like you have to wind up a clock to keep it ticking.
Yeah, kind of like that.
Okay. But this paper, this is suggesting something a little different, right? These true time crystals.
Exactly. This paper is exploring the possibility of time crystals existing without needing any kind of external force, like they just arise spontaneously in certain quantum field theories.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty mind-blowing. And this is where the ADS-CFT correspondence comes in. Honestly, that whole thing still sounds like like a mystery to me.
Sure, it's a complex idea, but it's also incredibly powerful. Okay, think of it like this. You've seen a hologram.
Right.
So a hologram is like a two-dimensional surface,
Right.
but it can project a three-dimensional image.
Right. Yeah.
Well, the ADS-CFT correspondence is kind of like that. It suggests that a theory of gravity in a higher dimensional space, and we call this space anti-de Sitter space, is actually equivalent to a quantum field theory on the boundary of that space. It's as if all the information about that quantum system is encoded on that boundary, just like in a hologram.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So instead of like a 2D surface creating a 3D image, we have this higher dimensional space projecting a lower dimensional quantum world.
Exactly.
Kind of like a cosmic projection screen. But how does this help us understand time crystals?
Well, this paper looks at a specific kind of black hole in this anti-de Sitter space called a Kerr-Adds-4 black hole. And what's interesting is recent simulations suggest that these black holes, when they rotate slowly, they don't settle into a stationary state like you'd expect. Instead, they exhibit these persistent, non-decaying oscillations.
So instead of just spinning smoothly, they're kind of like wobbling or vibrating.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. And the paper proposes that these oscillations, from the perspective of the ADS-CFT correspondence, could actually be the holographic fingerprint of a time crystal.
Hold on, so they're using the behavior of these wobbling black holes in this higher dimension to try to understand the potential existence of time crystals in this lower dimensional quantum world.
That's right.
It's like using a shadow to try to understand the shape of the object that's casting it.
Yeah, it's a pretty clever way to try to tackle a really complex problem.
Definitely. But of course, there's still a lot more research needed to actually confirm all of this.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, before we go any further, can we talk about this Penrose inequality? You mentioned that earlier, and honestly, it sounds a little intimidating. What is that exactly, and how does it connect to all of this?
Okay, so the Penrose inequality is a statement in general relativity that connects the area of a black hole's event horizon. So that's its point of no return to the black hole's mass. Basically, the bigger the black hole's mass, the larger its event horizon. And typically, this inequality is it's derived by assuming that the space-time around a black hole eventually settles down into a stationary state.
Okay, so a bigger black hole has a bigger event horizon, that boundary beyond which nothing can escape.
Right.
But how does time crystals, throw a wrench into all of this?
Well, if these holographic time crystals actually exist, and they're constantly changing, then the area of their event horizon wouldn't be fixed, right? And this could potentially violate the Penrose inequality.
So these time crystals, they might be breaking one of the fundamental rules of black hole physics.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see why this research is causing such a stir.
It's definitely challenging some of our core assumptions about how these systems behave.
Okay, so to test all this, they use something called designer gravity. Did I hear that right?
You did.
It sounds like they're like building their own custom universe.
In a way, they are. It's a framework that allows researchers to, kind of tweak the conditions and explore different theoretical models. It's a really powerful tool for exploring what's possible.
So they're essentially playing around with the rules of gravity to see what happens.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Fascinating. And what did they find? Did they manage to actually find any evidence for these elusive holographic time crystals?
Well, they didn't definitively prove or disprove their existence, but they did find some pretty interesting hints. Specifically, they found that when they were dealing with certain types of fields that have a big impact on the system's energy, the conditions for time crystals seemed a lot more favorable.
Okay, so it's like they're trying to narrow down the recipe for creating a time crystal. They're figuring out the right ingredients, but they haven't quite, baked the cake yet.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
All right, I'm definitely hooked. What were some of the other specific things that they did to, to test all of this? I'm ready to kind of get into the details here.
Well, one of the things they did was they focused on exploring the Penrose inequality, but in a simpler setting, a setting where they could really dive deep into the math. And they looked at a system where gravity is interacting with something called a scalar field.
Okay, hold on. A scalar field. Before we go any further, can you explain what that is?
Sure. So imagine like a temperature field in a room. At each point in the room, you have a specific temperature, right?
Right.
Well, a scalar field kind of like that. It assigns a specific value to each point in space.
Ah, I see. So it's a way to describe some property that varies throughout space?
Exactly.
Okay, now I'm ready to hear what they did with this scalar field.
Okay, so they explored specific scenarios where the scalar field is what we call coupled to gravity, meaning that they influence each other.
So it's not just gravity acting on its own, but it's interacting with this scalar field, which can then change how things behave.
Exactly. And they really focused on the situations where this interaction could actually violate something called the dominant energy condition.
Okay, wait, hold on. Another condition. I feel like we're going down this rabbit hole of physics terms here. What's this dominant energy condition all about?
Well, it's basically a fundamental principle in general relativity that it kind of governs how energy is distributed. And when this condition is violated, things can get, they can get pretty strange and unpredictable.
Okay, so they're really pushing the boundaries of what we thought we knew about gravity. And by exploring these scenarios, they were hoping to find situations where the Penrose inequality might break down.
Exactly. So to get into the really nitty-gritty details, they numerically constructed initial data for these theories, meaning they essentially set up the starting conditions for their simulations and then let the computer do the calculations.
So they're basically letting the computer run wild with these equations to see if anything unexpected pops up.
You could say that.
And what did they find?
Well, what they found was really interesting. In stable theories, meaning where the total energy is bounded from below so it can't just, collapse into this bottomless pit of negative energy, the Penrose inequality seems to always hold true, even in cases where you'd naively expect a violation.
So it's like there's this safety net built into the universe that prevents these really wild violations from happening, at least in the specific cases they studied.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it.
Does this mean then that holographic time crystals are just totally off the table?
Well, not necessarily. Keep in mind, they focused on systems that are spherically symmetric and electrically neutral.
Okay.
And actually, the paper even suggests that if you want electrically neutral time crystals in a 3D quantum field theory, well, if they were to exist, they would likely need some form of angular momentum or spin to be able to do so.
Ah, so it's possible that by adding a bit of spin into the mix, we could potentially unlock the possibility of these time crystals? It's like adding a whole new dimension to the problem, literally.
Indeed.
Okay. Well, this is also intriguing, but I'm curious, what did they find when they started looking at different types of scalar fields? It sounds like they went on quite a journey exploring, all these different possibilities.
They did, and they found that, some of these scalar fields led to more intriguing behavior than others.
So not all scalar fields are created equal, huh? It's like they were testing out different flavors of ice cream to see which one might lead to a time crystal sundae.
That's a fun way to think about it. And they discovered that these different types of fields could lead to some pretty unexpected outcomes.
Oh, okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me more about what they found.
Well, one thing they discovered was that by very carefully adjusting the properties of the scalar field, but at the boundary of their simulated spacetime.
Hold on, at the boundary. You mean like at the edge of their simulated universe?
Precisely.
Okay.
They found that by tweaking the properties there, they could actually influence the overall mass and stability of the whole system.
That's incredible. It's like they're pulling strings at the edge of the universe to see how the whole thing dances. But how does this relate to time crystals?
Well, this is crucial for understanding, how to potentially create those conditions that favor the emergence of time crystals.
So they're figuring out the recipe, but they haven't quite nailed down the baking process yet.
You got it.
I'm eager to hear more about what they did to test these ideas in the next part of our deep dive.
So they were able to show that in some situations, by tweaking those boundary conditions just right, they could potentially create conditions that might favor the emergence of time crystals. Kind of finding that sweet spot where all the ingredients come together.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, but it sounds like there's still a lot that we just don't know. I mean, did they actually manage to create a time crystal in their simulations, or are we still, waiting for that breakthrough?
Well, they didn't actually observe a time crystal directly, but their research really helped to narrow down the conditions under which time crystals might actually exist. And one of their key findings involved something called scaling dimensions.
Okay, scaling dimensions. That sounds familiar. I think we touched on that earlier, didn't we? Can you remind me what those are again and why they're so important in all of this?
Sure. So remember how we talked about the scalar field and how it influences the energy of the system?
Yeah.
Well, scaling dimensions are basically a way to measure the strength of that influence. You can think of them as like a measure of how much the scalar field matters in the overall scheme of things.
Got it. So like some scalar fields have a bigger impact than others, kind of like how some spices are more potent than others in a recipe.
Exactly. And what they found was that in scenarios where the scaling dimensions fell within a particular range, the conditions for time crystals seemed much more favorable. And they also discovered that in those same scenarios, there were no stable, hairy black holes that could kind of dominate the system and potentially prevent the emergence of time crystal behavior.
Hold on, hairy black holes. That's the second time we've run into that term. I'm starting to picture a black hole with like a cosmic beard or something.
Huh. Well, no, not quite like that. The hair in this case refers to additional features or properties that a black hole might have beyond its mass, charge, and angular momentum. It's basically a way of saying that these black holes are more complex than we might initially think.
Okay, so these hairy black holes, they've got some extra flair. I'm intrigued, but how do they relate to this whole, time crystal investigation?
Well, they're not directly related to time crystals themselves, but their presence or lack thereof can really impact whether or not time crystals can actually form. Think of it like this. If you want a delicate flower to grow, you need the right conditions, right?
Yeah.
And you can't have like a bunch of invasive weeds choking it out.
Right.
So in this case, the time crystal is our delicate flower, and the hairy black hole is kind of like that potential weed.
Okay.
And the researchers found that in some scenarios, the conditions were just right for the time crystal to potentially bloom without the hairy black hole weed getting in the way.
Ah, okay, so they're kind of like competing forces.
Yeah.
And by eliminating the hairy black hole weed, they're creating this like more hospitable environment for the time crystal flower to potentially grow.
Exactly. But keep in mind, they haven't actually observed a time crystal yet. It's more like they've identified the right soil conditions and planted the seed, but they haven't seen the sprout emerge just yet.
So we're still waiting for that time crystal bud to blossom. But even without direct observation, it sounds like this research is making some serious headway. I mean, they're really pushing the boundaries of what we thought we knew about these systems.
Oh, absolutely. Their numerical investigations have provided a wealth of information that will definitely help guide future research. And along the way, they've made some pretty surprising discoveries that have their own implications for our understanding of gravity and black hole physics in general.
Okay, I have to know more about these surprising discoveries. What else did they find while they were, digging around in this theoretical landscape?
Okay, well, remember how we were talking about the Penrose inequality and how it relates to the area of a black hole's event horizon? Well, they specifically dove deep into exploring potential violations of that inequality, which, as we discussed, could hint at the existence of time crystals or other exotic phenomena.
Right, because if a time crystal is constantly changing, then its event horizon wouldn't be static, and that could potentially mess with that whole inequality. So what did they find? Did they actually manage to break the Penrose inequality?
Well, to really get into the details, they focused on spherically symmetric systems in a four-dimensional spacetime known as ADS4. And they wanted to find those continuations of matter and gravity um, that could minimize the mass for a given entropy, because that's where you're most likely to find those violations of the Penrose inequality.
Okay, so they were trying to like pack as much matter as possible into a small region to see if they could like tip the scales and break the inequality. Kind of like seeing how many clowns you can fit into a tiny car.
That's a fun analogy. And to simplify their calculations, they made a clever assumption. They focused on configurations that exist at a moment of time symmetry, meaning that everything is momentarily still. Because adding any time-dependent motion would typically increase the system's energy. So this assumption is it's a reasonable starting point.
So it's like taking a snapshot of the system when everything is perfectly balanced, right? It makes the calculations a lot more manageable. Kind of like pausing a chaotic scene so you can really examine each element in detail.
Exactly. And to find these configurations, they derived this set of equations that describe the behavior of the scalar field and the spacetime geometry. And while these equations are complex, they could be solved numerically, which allowed the researchers to explore a wide range of possibilities.
So they let the computer do the heavy lifting, huh? Crunching the numbers to see if any solutions violated the Penrose inequality. And what did they find? Did their numerical exploration did it support their theoretical framework?
Their results were they were both intriguing and somewhat surprising, actually. They found that whenever their theoretical model had a lower bound on energy, meaning the system, it couldn't just collapse into a negative energy abyss, the Penrose inequality always held true. They tested various scalar fields with different properties, and consistently found that stable theories seem to respect the inequality.
So it's like the universe has this built-in safety mechanism that prevents these really exotic violations from happening. At least in the cases that they studied. I mean, that sounds kind of like a letdown. Does that mean that holographic time crystals are just completely off the table?
Not necessarily. Remember, their results, they primarily apply to spherically symmetric, electrically neutral systems.
Okay.
And actually, the paper even suggests that electrically neutral time crystals in a 3D quantum field theory, well, if they were to exist, they would likely require some form of angular momentum or spin.
So adding a bit of spin into the mix might be the key to unlocking the possibility of these time crystals, like adding a twist to the fabric of space-time itself.
You got it. And their findings highlight this delicate balance between the stability of a system and the emergence of these exotic phenomena. It seems like the universe might allow for time crystals to exist, but only under very specific and potentially difficult to achieve conditions.
It's like trying to bake a souffle, you know? It takes just the right conditions and a little bit of finesse to make it rise properly. But even if they haven't, cracked the time crystal code just yet, it sounds like they've uncovered some other pretty fascinating things along the way. You mentioned some surprising discoveries.
Yes, they delved into several distinct ranges of scaling dimensions. So those measures of how much influence a scalar field has. And they found that these different ranges led to some pretty unique behaviors. And in some cases, the scalar field behaved in ways that could potentially give rise to new types of black holes, like ones with properties that we just haven't seen before.
Wow. So they might have stumbled upon entirely new types of black holes while they were searching for something else. That's incredible.
It is it's a reminder that the universe is full of surprises, and sometimes the most unexpected discoveries are the ones that lead to the most groundbreaking advancements in our understanding of the cosmos. But we're not quite done yet. They explored even more fascinating aspects of these systems, including the behavior of the scalar field near the boundary of their simulated spacetime.
Okay, before we go any further, I have to admit my brain is getting a bit overloaded. It's like I've been on this roller coaster of physics concepts, time crystals, black holes, scalar fields. It's a lot to take in. Do you think we could maybe pause for a moment to recap what we've learned so far before diving into, the next layer of this research?
That's a great idea. I think it's always important to, take a step back and let everything sink in. We've covered a lot of ground from the basics of time crystals to the complexities of ADS-CFT correspondence, the Penrose inequality, hairy black holes, and even scalar fields with different scaling dimensions. It's a lot to digest.
It is, and I want to make sure that I'm following along. Could we maybe take a moment to summarize the key takeaways so far before we, move on to the next part of our deep dive? It'd be great to have a little refresher before we delve even deeper into the details.
Absolutely. Let's take a breath and recap what we've learned so far about these fascinating holographic time crystals.
Okay, I feel like I've just had this crash course in theoretical physics.
It is a lot to take in.
Time crystals, black holes, scalar fields. It's a lot to take in. But I'm ready to dive back in. Where were we?
We were about to explore how the researchers manipulated those properties of the scalar field, but at the boundary of their simulated spacetime.
Right. It's like they were tweaking the edges of their model universe to kind of see how it affected the overall system.
Right.
Did they find anything interesting when they play around with those boundary conditions?
They did. What they discovered was that by carefully adjusting those properties of the scalar field at the boundary, they could actually influence the overall mass and stability of the entire system. It was a very delicate process. But by fine-tuning these boundary conditions, they could create a really wide range of different scenarios.
So by making these small changes at the edge, they could have these big effects on the whole system.
Yeah.
It's like finding a pressure point that controls the entire universe. But how did they use this technique to investigate the Penrose inequality?
Well, remember, they were looking for those violations of the Penrose inequality, which could hint at the existence of time crystals or other exotic phenomena.
Right.
And by adjusting the boundary conditions, they could create systems that were, very close to violating the inequality.
So they were pushing the system to its limits, trying to see if they could break the rules.
Yeah, like a cosmic stress test.
Exactly.
And while they didn't find any definitive violations of the Penrose inequality in the stable systems that they studied, their research provided a lot of insights into the conditions that might favor the emergence of those violations. And they found that certain ranges of scaling dimensions, which we talked about earlier, they made the system more susceptible to these exotic effects.
So like they identified those weak points in the system.
Yeah.
The places where the rules might bend or even break.